All right, I think we are ready to go. So, welcome everybody to Horticulture Corner, River Friendly Yards. We're so happy to have you all here today on this beautiful summer day, actually. We are celebrating the 100th anniversary of the Garden Club throughout the year. And so thank you for being part of that by being here today, the 100th anniversary of the Garden Club. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Denise Reagan. I'm the Executive Director of the Garden Club of Jacksonville, and I'm here with Jill Zarletta, our new Marketing and Membership Manager. I'd like to thank the Jessie Paul DuPont Fund, who's gave us a very generous grant who makes programs like this possible, and we could not be more grateful for that. I'd also like to thank our new Horticulture Corner chairs, Mika Hardison and Susan Painter. We have a lot of really cool programs coming up. You'll see a couple of them coming up now, or actually after I talk about membership. If you're not a member of the Garden Club, it's always a good time to join. We have so many cool things coming up, and we really want you to be a part of them. So if you want to know how to be a member, just see me or Jill, and you can also go online, gardenclubjacks.org. And for some reason, I am missing my initial slides, but I will tell you about some upcoming programs that we have that are Horticulture Corner programs. We have our Healing Herbs program on July 12th. That is going to be very cool. That is with Catherine Bryan, who is with Healing Clinic. Oh my goodness, I don't have my notes, so I can't remember now. Has a really cool company, and she grows her own herbs and makes really cool potions. And that is on July 12th. So please check that out. That's just a month away. And we also have Horticulture Corner Orchid SOS. Some of you probably have some orchids that are not doing so well. I know I'm one of those people. And so we're going to have somebody from the Orchid Society who's going to help you figure out what's wrong with your orchid, show you some proper potting techniques and diagnosis for orchids. So that is August 2nd. Look for that on our website. All right, so now let's introduce Jimmy Orth. Jimmy Orth is the Executive Director of the St. John's Riverkeeper, who maintains all responsibility for budgeting, staffing, program development, fundraising, and public relations, as well as assisting the St. John's Riverkeeper, Lisa Renman, in the field. A native of Jacksonville, Jimmy has extensive experience working on environmental issues in Northeast Florida through his involvement with other environmental groups, including the Sierra Club, where he served as executive committee member for more than 8 years and as a regional chair. In 2003, Volunteer Jacksonville awarded Jimmy its Nature of Caring Award. Jimmy received his undergraduate degree from Florida State in marketing, and his master's degree in public administration from the University of North Florida. If you have questions for Jimmy, if you're here in person, we have a microphone for you because we want to capture your questions on the recording. So please use the microphone. That will help us a lot. We'll have time for that at the end. And if you're on Zoom, you can put them in the chat and we will pose them to him here. All right, with that, Jimmy, please take it away.
Yes, so let's start real quick. We're going to do a presentation about river-friendly yards, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about first about our organization, St. John's Riverkeeper. So St. John's Riverkeeper, we are essentially a watchdog group for the St. John's. We're a nonprofit advocacy group that advocates for policies that are going to protect the St. John's River, making sure that those policies are being enforced, so our river's being protected. And we do a lot with education too. We have an education staff that goes into the schools. We also have an outreach team that does a lot with outreach as well. And so our mission is really to engage the public and get people involved in figuring out ways that we all can contribute to help protect the river. One of those ways is obviously by what we do in our yards and the choices that we make. And so today we'll talk a little bit more about that. First, though, let me tell you a little bit more about the St. John's River, because I think it's important that we all get kind of oriented. So if you see this map of the St. John's, this is actually the whole watershed of the river, which is about 9,000 square miles, which if you think about how big that is, it's in context of the state of Florida, it's about 15% of the land area of the state of Florida. And when I talk about a watershed, I'm talking about all the land area that drains into the river and its tributaries. Now, the river flows 310 miles north. A lot of you may already know that. It starts west of Vero Beach in a swamp and starts to slowly meander north, goes through a series of lakes. Some people actually, it's actually been called the River of Lakes because there's so many lakes along the way that it flows through. And as I grew up, native of Jacksonville, I was told, I believe the urban legend that the St. John's is one of only like 3 rivers in the world that flow north of Nile. It's not true. Okay? It is fairly unique for a river to flow north, but there are hundreds that actually flow north. What makes the St. John's, though, really unique is the fact that it only drops about an inch a mile over that 310 miles. So it's a very, very slow-moving river. The gradient is just so gradual. And in fact, in some places around Palatka, it's essentially flat. So it's like more lake-like in Palatka. And what that means, too, is that the St. John's actually doesn't flush efficiently. So anything that goes into the river stays in the river for a long time. Another thing that compounds that effect of not flushing out pollutants and things that we put in it is the fact that it's tidal. So we live here in the lower basin. This is the lower third. So when I say lower, you got to get oriented. We're talking the northern part of the river. And we live in this section that is actually an estuary, meaning that it's a mixture of fresh and salt water. As that tide changes and it's actually a reverse flow and it comes into the St. John's from the ocean, you have that mixing of fresh and salt water. And so the tide can actually go, we can have a tidal influence that goes all the way to Lake George. If you see the big lake there, it's the second largest lake in Florida. And we can have the tidal influence can go that far south. So that means also that you have this kind of sloshing back and forth effect. So that what goes in the river stays in the river and stays in for quite a long time before it actually makes its way out to the ocean. Now, of course, we don't want pollution in the river in the first place. We'll talk about how we keep it out. Another thing that I think is important for us all to know is that you really can't look at surface water and groundwater separately. It's an interconnected system of hydrologic system of water. So here's the Floridan aquifer, which is where we get 90% of our drinking water in Florida, actually pretty much all the drinking water if you live in the watershed of the St. John's. And one of the things that is important about that is that those springs, the same place we get our drinking water is the source of springs. That same water is coming out of springs, and that there's about 100 springs that are documented in the St. John's watershed that produce about 30% of the freshwater flow of the river. So it's critical that those springs are flowing, that we're not using too much water and depleting our groundwater, not only for our drinking water, but also because it's such an important life source for the St. John's. Now, one of the big issues facing the river, one of the biggest issues is, there's a lot of them, but one of the biggest is that we have so many people now living in the watershed of St. John's. You have about over 5 million people living in the watershed. As more people continue to move here, we're building more rooftops and houses, we're building more roads, more impervious surfaces. When I say impervious, I'm talking about roads and sidewalks and driveways and all of those things that water rushes off of. And when it rushes off of all those surfaces and it can't infiltrate down into the soil, it picks up along the way a cocktail of pollutants along the way. It can be hydrocarbons from the roads and from parking lots, fertilizers and pesticides from our roads. It can be bacteria. It can cause all kinds of problems for the St. John's. And what happens is, you see as they flow into the storm drain, if you live in one of the older neighborhoods, Riverside, Avondale, Ortega, San Marcos, Springfield, that water is not going anywhere to be treated before it goes to the river. It goes straight to the river. So whatever goes in that storm drain is going untreated and makes its way and contributes to the pollution problems that we're seeing in the river. And so that's a big problem that we have to deal with. So what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to keep pollution up from leaving our yards and from our communities and from making it into the river in the first place. Now, another problem that is a result of the pollution that we're putting into the river are algae blooms. Have any of y'all seen algae blooms when you've been out on the river and you see this green slick? It almost looks like green paint has been spilled in the river a lot of times. And it can cover the surface. It can also be down in the water column. And what happens is this algae, which is, there's a lot of reasons that it occurs. It's naturally occurring. It's actually a cyanobacteria, by the way. It's not a true algae, but we call them blue-green algae. Is it starts to grow, and under certain conditions, it grows out of control. And then we see these blooms like this. Well, those blooms can be really problematic for the St. John, because what happens is they blanket out the sunlight that is really critical to get down to the submerged grasses that are underneath the surface of the river that are, and you've probably heard about the plight that we're facing our poor manatees, where they're starving to death in parts of our state. And one of the main reasons is a loss of the grasses that are so critical as a source of food for them. And so when these algae blooms grow, they block out the sunlight. They also, as they die, they use up all the oxygen in the water column. And then you can see fish kills, and it can cause problems for obviously wildlife. And it can clog the gills of fish and cause all kinds of problems for different kinds of aquatic organisms. Another thing too about these, and they're often referred to as harmful algal blooms or HABs, and the reason being is because they can actually, a lot of these different types of blooms can produce toxins, and these toxins can be harmful to our health, to wildlife, and of course even our pets. And so the toxins are released from some of these blooms, and if we get exposed to them, it could be on our skin and it can cause irritations. You can breathe them in because it becomes aerosolized, wave action, boats speeding through. It causes it actually to become airborne, these toxins, and we breathe them in, can cause respiratory problems. And even in large enough quantities, it can actually kill wildlife and pets. In some cases, when pets go and drink water when there's an algae bloom, it's actually killed dogs and household pets. And so it's a huge problem. Now, one of the things that causes these blooms is it's usually more prevalent during the summer months, and the reason being is because it's hotter, and that hot water is really fuels the blooms. And we have more sunlight. These algae or these cyanobacteria actually photosynthesize to get the source to create their own source of food. So more sunlight, they're actually growing more in more hot water, but it's also because there's more nutrients in the water. Now, nutrients are good, right? They're the building block of life. I mean, we need nitrogen and phosphorus, and those are naturally occurring, obviously. But what happens is when we have too many nutrients, excessive nutrients in our waterways cause this algae to grow out of control. So it's the same thing. You put fertilizer on your yard, you're putting it, has nitrogen in it, has phosphorus in it, usually, and you're putting it on your yard to stimulate your grass to grow. Same thing happens with the algae that's naturally, or the cyanobacteria that's naturally present in the water. It grows out of control and forms these blooms. And as I mentioned, one of the big causes is fertilizer. There's a lot of causes. It can be failing septic tanks. They are a contributor. We have also from industrial and municipal wastewater. So JA, when they treat our water or wastewater, but they're dumping most of it back into the waterways, and it still has nutrients in it. It actually has a high content of nutrients. If you use reclaimed water on your yard, it has nutrients in it. It can also come from, as I mentioned, fertilizer, and that's a big problem with agriculture. And then sewage sludge. One of the things that our organization's fighting is they're actually taking sewage sludge as a byproduct of treating wastewater, and they're putting it on farms as a way to dispose of the sludge. And then the farms use it, it's usually like cattle farms and ranches. They use it as a form of fertilizer to actually, and so they get paid to put it on their land, and then they also use it as a form of fertilizer, so it saves them money also from having to fertilize the grasses. But the problem is it runs off, and we're seeing a problem right now with the runoff from that sewage sludge. But we're going to talk about fertilizers here in a minute. Now, so here, what can you do? There's a lot of problems, as we just kind of touched on, affecting the St. Johns River, but the good news is we all can make a difference. And I think one of the best ways we can do that is in our yards, because there's a lot of things that people typically use on their yards and put on their yards that can contribute to these algae blooms and contribute to the problems that the pollution problems that our rivers face. And we're not going to talk about all these things right now because there's a lot of things that you can do that are listed here. We're going to jump right into the river friendly yard recommendation. Now, one of the things that years ago, we created a river friendly yards program, and this was back when we had very little staff, and so the executive director had to do a lot of the research and develop the program. We didn't have the outreach staff that we do today, or the education team. And so doing the research, I realized a lot of people really weren't recommending the use of beds as buffers. Now I put beds and buffers, but I like to think of the use of beds as buffers to help prevent runoff from leaving our yard. Now beds are great because if you have if St. Augustine grass, there's a lot of people that do. I actually, at the house I used to have, I had a pretty big lawn, and I just started chipping away. And I think that's one way that you can do it too. It can be overwhelming to think, oh, I'm going to go out and take all of my grass up. Most people aren't going to do that. It's time consuming. It can be costly. And a lot of people like grass. But if you can minimize that footprint of your grass in your yard, one way you can do that is by creating beds. And if you do that, like this is a great example of a bed along the St. Johns River. That's actually the Arlington River. And it's all native, doesn't require any fertilizer, doesn't require much irrigation at all. They don't use any pesticides on it. And so there's very little that's running off from the grass that was further up on their property, because there's this buffer that it's created with the mulch and with the native plants. So I think I like to think about taking these beds, expand your beds, then you have less grass to maintain, less fertilizer to apply if you're using the right types of plants, and the less pesticides to use. And you can also kind of think about trying to create an island, where anywhere there's impervious surfaces or there may be a waterway, it's just trying to surround your grass with these beds so that that very little of this will run off, make its way into the storm drain, as we talked about before, and harm the St. Johns River. Okay, okay. So here's another. So this is actually my house that I live in now, and this was a number of years ago. We had grass in our right of way. Grass in the right of way is really hard to maintain. First of all, you have impervious surfaces on both sides, so it's going to be hotter too. Any time that you have plants or grass beds right next to, it's hotter. It's going to be more evaporation, harder to water, and keep that irrigation on that site without actually watering the road and watering impervious surfaces. So we decided, let's take it out and let's put in native plants. And so it actually created a really beautiful right of way. My wife loves it because she gets to we have a small yard, and gave her more places to plant the plants she loves to plant, to her hobby. And we get tons of compliments from people because there's not many houses that look like ours. I mean, some people might say it looks a little unruly sometimes, but we get so many people say, I love your yard because it's so diverse and there's so much, and we get, as a result, all kinds of wildlife and butterflies and birds and bees. And so it's really a great way to enjoy nature as well. Now, one thing I encourage is obviously use a good 2 to 3, maybe even sometimes 3 to 4 inches of organic mulch. Don't use cypress mulch, because when they create cypress mulch, they're literally cutting down cypress trees, which are really critical to the health of ecosystems and wetlands, and they're using that and chipping it up into mulch. What I always recommend is, my favorite is actually pine straw. I love pine straw, and it'll break down. It actually improves your soil as it breaks down, and it holds moisture, and then you can just replenish it as needed. Also pine bark, I like the really fine pine bark personally, because it again breaks down quicker and actually amends your soil and improves your soil. And even leaves. My wife is funny. When it's time, when there's oak leaves around, she's driving around filling her Prius with bags of leaves, and she comes back and always laugh because how she ever fits that many bags of leaves into that little car. But she uses them all over in our backyard. Like, we actually eliminated, because we have a lot of shade and the grass didn't do too well, so we eliminated all the grass in the backyard, and it's pretty much all leaves that she used. Now we have actually pine straw, but she uses it in her chicken coop and all different places. So the leaves are a great, obviously, way to mulch as well. The other thing too that you can do if you're really ambitious is create a rain garden. And these are pretty simple to do. It's a simple concept. You're essentially looking, you may have a natural depression in your yard already, or you can create one. It's not very deep. It's just a shallow depression where you can direct rainwater. You can do it like with your downspout and direct it that way so instead of it running off, and maybe some people have their downspouts directed onto the driveway, for instance, direct it into the yard, into the rain garden, and put plants that can tolerate their feet getting a little wet on occasion. But make sure you have soil that drains really well, These are actually really popular in some other parts of the country. For some reason, they haven't caught on here as much, but like Philadelphia has a program where they actually they subsidize rain gardens for homeowners. They can get funding to help implement one because they're really trying to reduce the amount of stormwater that is running off into their waterways. And they can be quite beautiful too, because you have these plants and it's helping the water to filtrate down into the soil. And what happens too is if it's carrying any kind of pollution from, let's say, your driveway or even from your roof, it filters it out naturally through the soil and the plants and helps break down those pollutants naturally so that they're actually not making their way out to the river. And these can be complex too. I mean, you can get into having under drains and all kinds of different, but it really is a very simple concept as long as you have a soil mixture that will drain well. Here's a rain garden. I just love this one. This is in Gainesville, and I'm trying to remember. It's an athletic complex at Gainesville. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but this is really beautiful. Actually, you see this purple. It's like an artistic cover that goes around the pipe that's coming off of the roof. So all of the rainwater that's coming off of the roof is being directed down into this channel here where you see these rocks, and then it filters out into those rain gardens onto the side, each side of that channel. So none of this water that's coming off the roof is making its way out to the street, which would then end up obviously into the storm drain. And it's helping these plants to grow, and it's helping to filtrate that water. In some places, unfortunately, in where we live, it doesn't percolate down and recharge our aquifer, because where we live, there's a pretty thick confining layer of clay that prevents it. So when it comes down and hits that clay, it goes laterally, the water, and so it's not actually making its way down to the, but in some places, that's one of the benefits of a feature like this, is actually can help replenish the aquifer as well. Again, I mentioned native plants. I love native plants, and I think there's a lot of reasons to use them over non-native plants. One is that if you get the right plant, and that's the key with any of this, it's right plant, right place. So you want to make sure that you're picking plants that will thrive in the conditions in your yard. You don't want to put a plant that needs full sun, obviously, in a shady spot. You don't want to put a plant that likes really dry soils in a place that stays wet a lot. So it's really making sure that you're picking the right plant. But native plants typically are adapted to our local climate. And so they tend to do better, require less fertilizer, less water. And so they also provide habitats. A lot of the non-native plants, trees, really have no habitat value whatsoever, because a lot of these insects and wildlife don't recognize those, as they haven't evolved with these plants. They don't recognize them as food, as sources of food. And so I'll show you a picture in a minute, but there's a guy, Doug Tallamy, who I think he's got a book, Bringing Nature Home, and it's probably the best case I've ever heard for why natives are so superior and so important, because they really are. We've destroyed so much natural habitat that his premise is we have to kind of bring nature back into our yards, because we're running out of natural spaces, and we need to use our yards as a place that we can help provide that additional habitat that wildlife.
Shameless plug. I will say that Doug Tallamy did a horticulture program that we did in combination with several other local organizations. He was on Zoom here. We had, I think, 200 people here in this auditorium, but that is recorded and it's up on our website, on our blog, and I highly recommend it.
Yeah, absolutely. He's fascinating, and he has several books now actually that are really great, and I would encourage you to, and I'll talk about those a little bit later. It's talking, so if you could advance it, that'd be great. Now, what I tell people a lot of times is, if there's one thing you can do to help protect the river, plant a tree. Trees are one of the best things to help protect our waterways, because they are incredible tools to help manage stormwater. First of all, there's a lot of benefits, obviously, wildlife habitat and things like that. But trees can intercept, for one, a tremendous amount of water in their canopy, meaning that that water doesn't make its way to the ground, which then, as we talked about, can run off, picking up all kinds of pollutants and make its way in the storm drain out to the river. It also helps to infiltrate with their roots, create a system that they can take up a lot of water, and they help, and especially certain types of species of trees, help to treat that water and remove those pollutants, which is really important. They also prevent erosion. And so trees are so important for helping to filter out pollutants and protect, slow down stormwater and keeping it out of our waterways. But there's also so many other benefits, like we mentioned before. Doug Tallamy, if you read his book, you'll hear about how important they are for wildlife and habitat, especially trees like live oaks. Live oaks support more wildlife than any other species of tree on this planet. And that's something that, you know, I was encouraged. They're slow growing, unfortunately, live oaks, but there's a lot of other native tree species. And one of the good things is that the city has lots of money for trees, to plant trees. We need to encourage them to spend that money faster, because we have a tree mitigation fund. As developers to take down trees, they have to pay into a fund, and that money can be used to plant more trees. But what they do have also is they have a program where you can call the city and you can request a tree in your right of way. Unfortunately, they won't put it in private property, so it has to be in the right of way, but we need to change that. But they will come out, they'll help you select the right tree for your location, and they'll plant it in your right of way if you don't already have trees in your right of way. So, and they'll do that for free. And then they'll maintain it too for a while. They're contractors, so that you don't have to water anything, and then you'll have a great thriving tree in a couple of years. So now that we've talked about kind of slowing everything down, we'll talk about some of the things that we want to try to minimize in terms of the pollution that we want to keep out of that stormwater before it actually makes its way out to the river in the first place. One of those things is fertilizers. And if you know, as I mentioned before, one of the biggest sources of nutrients in the river is actually from runoff. It can be from fertilizer from agriculture, but it's also just from residential yards. And a lot of people, when I started looking at this years ago, it can be really challenging. If you're a do-it-yourselfer and you're trying to go to the store and read that label on the back of the bag, and you're trying to do a calculation about how many pounds of nitrogen per square feet of your yard you're supposed to put on your yard, it can be daunting. But it's not something that I encourage you, don't get discouraged, because it's important that you don't apply too much fertilizer. One, because if you put on too much, the plants can't use it and take it. It rains, most of it's going to run off into the river. But also because it can actually cause your plants to be unhealthy, frankly. When you put on too much fertilizer, it's not encouraging your plants to grow their roots really deep. And it encourages really fast, rapid growth, and it makes your lawn can make your lawn actually less resilient. So what we're looking for is we're looking for slow release fertilizer. That means that 50%, at least 50%, and there's some that are a lot higher, at least 50% of that nitrogen that's in that bag is in a slow release format, meaning that it slowly releases those nutrients over time, as opposed to a water-soluble fertilizer, which means that it just releases all at once, and it can run off a lot quicker. And so what we're trying to do is slowly feed that grass, not give it a shot of fertilizer or nutrients all at once. And so this is a formula that is pretty easy to look at. So when you look at the first number is nitrogen, the middle number is phosphorus. Now, most yards our soils in Florida naturally have a lot of phosphorus, and typically you don't need any phosphorus at all. It's not going to benefit your grass. It's not going to, and it's actually going to, if your yard can't use it, and if the grass can't use it, it's going to probably run off and cause nutrient pollution, be a source of nutrient pollution in the river. So look for a 0 on that, unless you do a soil test and it says that your yard's deficient in phosphorus. But then what you're going to do is you're going to take that first number, which is the nitrogen, and at the bottom, there's always a percentage. It'll tell you what percentage of that nitrogen is slow release. And you can see the calculation up here. So in this case, it's 7% slowly available. You're going to divide that by 14, which is the percentage of nitrogen in the bag, times 100. And there you go. You got 50%. So this is a 50% slow release fertilizer, which is what we want to look for. Now, also unfortunately, Jacksonville, we do have a fertilizer ordinance, but we do not ban the application of fertilizer in the summer. A lot of counties around the state, and actually a lot of them in the watershed of the St. Johns, including like Seminole County and Orange County, have banned the application of fertilizer during the summer months, the rainy months, because when we get these big rainstorms, it can actually wash off a lot of this fertilizer and contribute to the pollution in our waterways. And so typically what the ban is between May and September. So they usually recommend, well, actually, I'm sorry, April and September, and recommending you don't fertilize, in other words, after April and before October. And that's what we would suggest too at Riverkeeper, is that you try to avoid applying the fertilizer in the summer. If you need to green up your lawn in the summer, use an iron or something like that. But then also trying to minimize the number of times that you apply the fertilizer. We recommend 2 times. The University of Florida IFAS program, they have different levels of maintenance. We recommend the basic level of maintenance, which is 2 times a year, which is basically each application. That's the other thing too, is, and we have this information on our website too if you want to look at it, but it can get complicated about how much. So what you want to do is limit it to like a pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. Again, the calculations can be tough. Now, if you have a yard service at your yard, you need to talk to them and ask questions. Ask them what's the rate of application they're putting down? How frequently are they doing this? Do they follow the green industry's best management practices? Because there are best management practices that we encourage all of the landscape contractors to make sure that their staff, their employees are trained in those BMPs, because it's really important that they know too, that they're not incentivized to apply more fertilizer or more frequently. That now they'll tell you, oh, we want to minimize the amount of fertilizer because it costs us money. Well, that may be true, that they have an incentive to put the right amount each application, but they also have an incentive to apply it more frequently than is maybe necessary, because every time they come out, they get paid. And so I think it's really important you talk to your landscape professionals if that is something that you have a service for. And I will give a plug for Climate Yard. I know they were scheduled to speak. A representative from Climate Yard was scheduled to speak, and Denise asked me to step in last minute after they were unfortunately to cancel. But I will say that I'm always skeptical when somebody says, "Oh, I've got this product. You don't need fertilizers. You're going to create this great green yard, and it's completely beneficial for the river and for our environment." But I did look into this. I actually went to the owner's home, and he gave me a tour of his yard where he's using this product, talked to his staff. And I do think that there is some evidence from what I've seen in research that shows that this can be beneficial. Essentially, what this product is doing is not a fertilizer. It's actually putting the fungi and the bacteria that is natural in the soil. It's amending it with more of these beneficial microbials back into the soil, so that it's helping create healthy soil. That's really the key to all this. Healthy soil is the key to healthy plants and healthy yards. And so their premise is that if we can create healthy soil by putting what is naturally present and helping to boost that fungi and those microbials in the soil, that it can actually create a healthy, thriving yard without the need for fertilizers. And so what I've seen so far, it can't hurt, let's put it that way. So the question will be is, if you decided to use a product like this, is it working for you, and do you feel like it's having the results that you want? But from what I've seen, it seems like it could be a very promising product, because anything where we don't have to use fertilizers, in my book, is a good thing.
And we do have a horticulture program that we did with Alan Skinner, who owns a company called Soil Life Organics. He works very closely with Clara White Mission, which has White Harvest Farms, which is a great organization. You should go and check out what they do. Go to their weekly sales of produce. But he works very closely with them to create really healthy soil, and that program is up on our blog as well.
Yeah, so I think this is promising, in what Alan does too, and I think that's hopefully this will be something that more and more people are starting to look to use, and we can get away from especially synthetic fertilizers, which there's a lot of other problems associated with them too. They contribute to global warming and things like that as well in the manufacturing process. Another thing too is trying to just minimize the amount of pesticides and herbicides you need. I think that's something we as a society have to get used to being a little more tolerant of a few weeds here and there. And matter of fact, I think too, as long as your yard isn't too big, I mean, trying to hand pick weeds and keep them under control too, that way as best you can, or spot treating. You don't need to spot treat the whole yard. You can try to control pests and weeds potentially by spot treating and using the least toxic product that you can. I always think it's interesting when you see the signs that these companies put in the yards, and it's like, keep your pets off, keep your kids off your yard. That should be a sign to us that if our kids are not safe on our yards or our pets are not safe, maybe this isn't good for us that we're putting these pesticides out there. And I have to say, Jeff Meyer, the owner of Climate Yard, that's one of his big things, is he feels like that's one of the biggest problems facing our environment right now is all of these chemicals that are so prevalent in our environment. The other thing too is just, and a lot of this is common sense, but I don't think people think about it a lot of times. It's like if you have an in-ground system, for instance, and you have a controller, a lot of people set it and forget it. They put it on, they say, okay, I don't have to worry about it anymore. And I've seen so many people where their irrigation systems are poorly maintained. They're watering the yard. They're watering at the wrong time of day. They're watering right after there was a big storm. And part of it is because they're just not paying attention. And so I think one thing is whenever we water, is trying to do everything we can to keep that water on our yard and not onto the impervious surfaces like this, because as we water our yard, one thing we're doing is we're wasting water. Two, it's running off into our storm drains, into our waterways. The one thing too that a lot of people don't think about is what we're putting in our yards is potable water. We have actually paid to treat that water to drinking water standards. We're taking drinking water. And I've often thought about what people in some of these other countries where they're experiencing drought and they have to walk, miles to get water, would think if they saw, and we said, yeah, that's potable water that you can drink that we're using on our yards. And a lot of that is, like in this case, running off. I mean, it's really, I think we've just gotten so used to water is abundant and available. And that's not going to be the case forever, because what we're seeing our springs, the flow is slowing. We're seeing the aquifer is being depleted. And as more people move here and we experience things like potentially more droughts in certain times of the year because of the climate change, this could become more daunting, and water could become obviously a lot more scarce. And another thing too is overwatering your yard is not good. It's not good for your yard. And it can actually invite insects into your yards and create a much less resilient yard, because what you want is you want those roots to grow deep so that your grass is hardy whenever there are those drought conditions. And then these are some, just inspecting, making sure that there's not broken sprinkler heads, making sure that the sprinkler heads are directed in the right way, and connections. I mean, even a small leak can waste thousands of gallons of water over time. And then finally, just again, like watching the rainfall, making sure that you're paying attention. So you turn the system off if there's approaching storm or if we've already had a lot of rain. On the top right, that's just a smart controller that you can buy. These things, like this one's a Rachia, which I did some research on, and it's got some of the highest ratings. And it's a little over $200, and you can control it with your smartphone, and it actually communicates with Doppler radar and is essentially monitoring the weather patterns to help you optimize your irrigation so that you're not overwatering. And so we have technology that's available that can help us. And then the other thing is just selecting the right type of irrigation for the different locations in your yard. So like this is drip irrigation, which is very efficient. So you can use around trees. You don't need spray irrigation. The micro irrigation too puts out a very small spray that you can use in your gardens. My wife uses it in our little container gardens we have. And then rain barrels, you're not going to water your yard with the amount of water you collect potentially in a rain barrel, but it is a great way to water your houseplants and things like that. And then a couple other things too is just pervious pavers and thinking about that also. Another way to slow the flow, keep water from making its way off your property is pervious pavers. A good example of that too is at the Cummer. If you walk into their parking lot, they actually have a pervious pavers in their parking lot that allows the water to filtrate down as opposed to running off of that surface. And so that's a great way to put those type of materials in place. Same thing like in our driveway is gravel, for instance, which is great. We don't have nearly as much water running off. It infiltrates down into the ground. And then if you really get ambitious, you can do things like underground cisterns with pumps that you can collect enough water to water your yard. And I thought this was really cool, the one on the bottom right. That's a rain barrel, which I thought was cool. That collects 300 gallons of water. It's a bench that they have installed a rain barrel system inside with a pump, and then they irrigate their plants using the system, and it doubles as an attractive bench. And then we'll talk real quick. This is getting to the end of the presentation is I always say, you know, seek help and ask questions. The great thing is now with the internet, all this information is available at your fingertips. I mean, you can go to our website. We have lots of information. Pick up Doug Talamy's book here, Bringing Nature Home. He also started a program called Homegrown National Park, and you see the website there. And he's really encouraging people to create essentially like your own national park in your own backyard. And there's great resources on his website. I would go check that out at Homegrown National Park. And then if you're interested in like having JEA will come out and they'll do it for free. You just have to call them and they'll help you look at your sprinkler system and help you to optimize your sprinkler system and look at ways that you can water more efficiently. And then when I talked about the Florida Green Industries best management practices, this is the manual here on the right. Again, if you have a lawn service, ask questions. Don't just hand them a check each month. Make sure you're hiring people that actually are going to do what is necessary to try to reduce the amount of fertilizer, and they're going to try to help you to protect the environment through your yard and landscaping practices. Oops. And then one other thing. And then locally, we have some really great consultants in plant nurseries. One is Native Plant Consulting. They're actually out of St. Augustine, and just, I think all of these, it's like nativeplantconsulting.com. It's pretty easy. You can Google. They have a great selection of native plants they sell, but then they also do consulting. It'll help you design your yard. Earthworks, same thing. They have native plants. And they actually have also a lot of organic, different types of organic products that you can help use more in insecticides and things that are a little more better for the environment. Native Jacks, they do permaculture actually, which I'm not going to get into what the whole premise of permaculture is, but that is a great company locally. I think, did he do a program for you before?
Yes, he has.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And he is a great person that could come out and do some consulting. And Waka Pilaka is in Riverside, and I follow them on Instagram and love the work they do and the transformations of yards that I've seen on Instagram. And Southern Horticulture, if you're out more at St. Augustine Beach, one of my wife's favorites, she always makes a road trip out there to Southern Horticulture, and they have a good selection of native plants as well. And then if you go on to Green Gardening Matters, this is Jenny Steibolt, and she's a local expert on organic gardening, native plants, and this is a book she wrote, Florida Native Yards. She has actually lots of books about organic gardening and native plant landscaping, and lots of really good resources on her website as well. So there's a wealth of information out there to help you make good decisions. We have on our website, St. John's Riverkeeper, we have a whole section on river-friendly yards and just how to be river-friendly in general. So I encourage you to check it out. So you got no excuses now. You got to go out now and get in those yards. And of course, don't fertilize now because your yards, because we're in the rainy season. We're not going to do that again until the fall, right? And try to look at how you can maximize, minimize your footprint on using your yard as a way to really try to help protect our river. So I appreciate y'all having me, and now we'll open it up to some questions.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Jimmy. All right, so we already have some questions on Zoom, and if you have questions here, we ask you to go up to the microphone, and so we can capture them in the recording. So don't be shy. Please do that. Eva is here to help direct you up there and make it so that it doesn't seem like it's a scary thing. Thank you, Eva. All right, so I do have one question before we get to the Zoom questions. And one of Doug Talamy's, kind of principles is just do one thing. Just do one thing. That's all. Start with one thing. So what is your one thing that you do that like makes you feel like, okay, I'm doing my one thing?
Oh, gosh. Well, it's funny, like when it comes to river-friendly yards, I mean, we've kind of created a yard that doesn't require, we don't use any fertilizers. And I don't do a lot of the work in the yard because Janora, and she loves to garden. So that's her thing. So I don't do one thing. But I think the bottom line is just, I try to be conscious. That's the one thing I tell people, always told people is just be conscious. Think, it's kind of like when you turn, my son, he's 14 years old, turns the water on and just keeps it running and keeps it running. And it's like, son, do you realize you're wasting on, oh, I didn't even think about it. I'm like, that's what a lot of us do as adults too. We don't think. And so that's, to me, is just be present and think about the potential impacts of your actions. And that's what I try to do. Not always successful.
Great. Well, it looks like we have somebody to ask a question here. So go ahead.
Hi. We moved to our house in San Marco, which is on the next to Colonial Manor Lake, which is called the Duck Pond over there, 20 years ago. And 20 years ago, we had wood ducks, mallards, just tons of wildlife. Now we have nothing. We might have some Canada geese fly in for a day and then they'll leave. We might have a mallard or two fly in for a day and then they will leave. We've been maintaining with the city and arguing with our council person that all of the herbicides and pesticides are poisoning the pond, which is a retention pond, which somebody from the city says, no, it's not a retention pond because he doesn't want to treat it. But the point is that they're not, when we had them test the water, they tested for nitrogen, they tested potassium, but nobody's testing for pesticides. Nobody's testing for anything, herbicides that's going to kill stuff.
Right.
And we had, JU came out and did the testing and they weren't looking at the right stuff. How do you do that?
Well, that's one of the challenges is that, I think the state, for instance, is so fixated right now, like on the algae blooms,
Yeah.
So they're, like you mentioned, they want to know what the nitrate levels are. But yeah, that's one of the challenges is we're not really testing all the time for the right things. And there's a lot of things in our environment that we really are not aware of because we don't have a lot of information because either we're not testing for it or there's a lot of things called chemicals of emerging concern, for instance, that we're putting things like all kinds of pharmaceuticals into our waterways that don't get treated out by wastewater treatment plants. We have all these pesticides that we don't, in a lot of cases, there's not even been a lot of testing. A lot of the chemicals that are put into our environment that they get approved before they've really been extensive testing. And so that's one of the challenges too, is the regulations aren't there to help prevent these things from going in our waterways. And so when they're not heavily regulated, we're not seeing the type of testing that is required.
One of the things that I've also noticed that would be in the last certainly 10 years, maybe 5 years, has been the tremendous growth in terms of companies that are doing mosquito sprays. And those are killing bees, or killing butterflies. And because of the tremendous growth in that recently, I'm thinking that might be what's contributing to what's going into the pond that's killing everything in the pond is that.
Right. No, that makes sense. I mean, I can
mosquito treatment.
Yeah, I mean, if it's killing mosquitoes, it's probably, there is some toxicity there, obviously.
Obviously.
And that's one of the things. I mean, we do this. I mean, we have issues too, like even in the St. John's, lots of areas where you have these invasive plants that are growing, out of control in areas. And instead of doing like mechanical harvesting, the state agencies, they go out, they pay contractors to spray. I mean, they have literally airboats with these huge hoses and they're spraying all of the vegetation along the shore of the river. And, and they say it's safe. They'll say, oh, no, it's fine. These herbicides are fine. But, and then you talk to the anglers, the fishermen are out there all the time and they're saying, no, it's not. Just like you're seeing species of wildlife disappear. They're seeing the same thing. And so it is. I think there's a proliferation of chemicals that are going into our environment. And frankly, it's ending up in our bodies too.
Yep,
if you look at things, even like microplastics that we're putting as these tiny particles of plastics break down or are put into our environment, they're finding it in the bloodstream of people all over the world now. And so we're being poisoned, essentially, us and the wildlife. But I think that's a great observation, and obviously something hopefully that we can encourage our elected officials and our regulatory agencies to do more about.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, please go ahead.
We have a simpler question. Okay. Planting on a deck. I just need to be taller instead. We're planting on a deck next to the river, and it's extremely windy. Who has a recommendation for wind-resistant tough plants?
That's a good question. Now, I'm not a plant expert, so I don't know specifically, and I've never had to deal with very windy conditions myself. You look like you might have a recommendation.
So ornamental grasses is being suggested by some in the audience, and I'll put that out to the collective here because I know we have some experts on the chat that might have some examples of plants for windy conditions. So I'll let you know if I get some responses on here as well.
And I would like to ask about what growing zone is this area exactly?
I believe we're in zone AB, 9AB,
9B?
9, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it's, it varies from St. Augustine's.
Yeah, and one of the things that, climate change is actually doing is our zones are going to change.
They are.
And that's a scary thing to think about, but it's happening. And so we have to be prepared to have, our zone get a little more tropical in nature.
We also have some varieties of plants here, and I am not certain that they are native. I mean, just because they sell them at a local nursery doesn't mean they're native, I found out. But can I give you a couple of names and see? Well, you're not a plant expert, but if this would be good in this same place, this pool deck.
I would suggest Florida Native Plant Society.
Okay.
Yes.
Has a really extensive list of plants that you can peruse. And they have a great website with lots of information. So yeah, we can get that information for you so you can check it out against that.
Okay.
Yeah, and that I think it was on my slide, the last slide that had Native Plant Society, and then of course, the blog that I had mentioned too with Jenny Steibolt, who's a real expert and has some great resources as well.
Okay.
And then, you can always find hopefully like people that, neighbors, and that there's a lot of people with some expertise that I know,
right,
former
right.
landscape architects that are
Right.
retired in Riverside and
Right.
Avondale that are really great resources. And one place too to go check out, I didn't mention this when I showed the slide of native plants, but there's Native Park that's here in Riverside, and the Native Plant Society, the local chapter, the Ixia chapter, actually maintains it. And it's a great place because they have little name placards that you can go and see different plants, what they look like actually in the park, and see if it might be something that would be appropriate for you. And I always encourage that because it's hard sometimes when you're in a nursery or you're even on a website, you want to see what it looks like actually planted in the landscape. And so I think that's a great place to go check out.
Okay. Was
Yeah,
that on a garden tour recently that
Could have been. I
I
don't
missed
know.
part of that. What's that?
Was it on the garden tour? The river was.
I
the native
believe
plant
it
park?
might
Yeah,
have
yeah.
been. Yeah,
I
yeah.
see.
So
We went
Native
by
Parks 1 and 2 that are both in Riverside, Avondale.
Okay.
Both of them are maintained by Nicholas Freeman, who owns Waka Palatka,
Okay.
along with the local chapter Ixia of the Florida Native Plant Society.
Okay. all right.
And they have meetings, and they're a really good group to get involved with as well.
Are they still meeting at Willow Branch Library?
I think they're doing most of their stuff on Zoom right now,
Okay.
but hopefully we'll be
Yeah.
getting back to person. Yeah.
But that's always a great way is to,
Right.
is like get with the chapter folks, because so many people in the chapter, like of the Ixia chapter locally, are just so knowledgeable.
Right.
And the way I learned to start identifying plants, I don't know the Latin name, I just know the common name, but a lot of the plants that I'm able to identify when I go on hikes and things like that that are native, that I then say, oh, I would like to see that in my yard. is I've just gone on hikes with people that are very knowledgeable, like the
Yeah.
Ixia chapter may lead a hike, and I'll just bombard them with questions. What's that? And then finally, after you ask them enough time, the same plant over and over, you finally start remembering it.
Right.
And that's a great way to really learn about what plants you like and what looks good. And you can kind of look at the conditions in which it's growing. If it's under, an understory, if it's in an understory, or if it's in the, out in a sandy open space or something like that. I think that's always a great way. And then also it's fun just to go out, obviously, and explore the outdoors.
Thank you.
Sure.
We have another question here in person, and then we'll get to some of them on Zoom as well.
Okay, I wanted to ask about flea control. So I've just recently moved to the area and I've had some problems. So of course, I did what I knew, which was I removed all the leaf litter and then I've been spraying. But do you have any advice for maybe how to better handle fleas without having to use so much pesticide?
I'm not really sure, honestly, about that. I mean, there's like
Yeah, so,
diatomaceous earth you can use, I
yeah,
believe.
there's a
and-
lot of those kind of, so I would definitely recommend going to like a place that specializes in natural pest controls. Like the Plant Place is a place, a nursery in Arlington. Waka Palaka, I bet, has some of that. And
Earthworks,
Florida
I think,
Native
has-
Plant Society is going to have some really good ideas, because one of their kind of bases is that, you don't want to treat the symptom. You want to, get to the root of the problem. I didn't mean that to be a pun, but that kind of turned out that way. So yeah, like fleas are a symptom, but like, why are the fleas there? But, and are there like things that you could introduce that would help, like get rid of that problem in a natural way? I'm certainly not the expert in that for sure. So yeah.
You sounded like it.
Well, I mean, I've learned a lot, but I'm definitely not an expert. All right, so we have some questions on Zoom, and while other people are figuring out if they have questions here. So we have, do you recommend using St. Augustine sod instead of herbicides for managing weeds? St. Augustine sod instead of herbicides for managing weeds. Okay, so basically like this is, supposed to be maybe like a more, a hardier stock of sod or something? I don't
Well,
know.
I mean, St. Augustine I mean, personally, I'm not a big fan of St. Augustine grass because I think it's not as hardy as there's some new species. I know that they're also cultivating different types of species of grass that are more hardy. I haven't really looked at, I mean, there's a lot of changes lately, so I'm not exactly sure what's the best one that's the most hardy. I mean, obviously, Bahia grass is probably your most hardy. Some people don't like the way it looks because it does grow, puts the shoots up and things like that. But I mean, I personally, it's hard for me to say because I'm not someone that recommends sod.
Oh, and I missed a key preposition here. Would you recommend using on St. Augustine sod instead of herbicides for managing weeds?
Oh, okay. I see.
Missed a key preposition there, sorry.
Yes. Well, I mean, it's hard. And again, I'll be honest, I haven't done a lot of my homework on specific types of herbicide because usually when I did it before, it's when I had sod. I was trying to figure out the least toxic alternative. But I have heard that some people, and I don't know, if you use a mixture of vinegar and water, like dollarweed and things, it causes it to dry up. It causes it to shrivel up the leaves or to burn out. But I would have to look and see, that's where I think it's best to go to some place like you mentioned, Plant Place or Earthworks, and ask them, say, listen, I want the least toxic, alternative that you have. Can you recommend something that, and then again, it's spot treating. And I think too, is if it's not out of control, trying to hand weed as much as you can.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, I'll tell you, when I was going through a divorce years ago, what saved my mental health was weeding. Okay. I spent a lot of time out there because it was mindless, and it's a great way, honestly, sometimes to just get away from all the hassles of life and get out there and hand weed in your yard. And I spent a lot of time, and it actually was great therapy.
That's really great advice. Yeah. One of the things that we've talked a lot about as the Garden Club as an organization, and we have a fair amount of sod that is on our space. And as we're considering a landscape redesign, and we're working with a landscape architect on that right now. How can we lessen the amount of sod, the amount of grass that we have in our space? Because if you've been following, there's been a lot of research and a lot of really great stories about how, every place that you see grass is basically a dead space, right? Nothing is like really living there. It's just the grass that's growing, but it's not doing anything for the environment. It's not doing anything for habitat. It's not doing anything to create part of the ecosystem that we all want to be a part of. So, how can we lessen the amount of grass that we, incorporate into our, spaces? And what are some good replacements? I know we've done some programs on different kinds of ground cover that can be really beneficial to the environment and to the ecosystem and look really pretty too.
Right.
So yeah, it doesn't always have to be sod. There are other options as well.
Well, and I think too, even if you do maintain sod, the key of any of this is if you have is the health of your turf grass. The healthier it is, the better. I mean, and the thicker it is, it's going to prevent some of those weeds. A lot of times where you see in a lot of grass is where it's kind of, it's really patchy and stringy, and that gives opportunities for, it's a lot of opportunities for weeds to emerge. And so, that's kind of the premises of Climate Guard, is that if you can improve the soil health, which improves the health of your turf grass, then you can actually avoid using some of these pesticides potentially and herbicides as well. So I think it's, that's one of the things, but you're right. There's a lot of alternatives. Challenge is a lot of times, though, is some people have such huge yards. I mean, to go and actually replace it with another ground cover is daunting. And so again, my recommendation is just try to create the healthy, don't overwater so that those roots can grow really deep and you have strong, resilient turf grass, and don't over fertilize because it's actually going to hurt your grass. It actually makes it more susceptible, frankly, to those weeds, because as your grass is growing, it's also helping those, but those fertilizers are helping those weeds grow too. It's stimulating that weed growth, and it's also creating a less resilient lawn. That's going to be harder to maintain, frankly. And you're going to have to use more chemicals, and it's going to create more work for you. But I think too, that's the other thing when we talk about climate change. Actually, Jenny Steibold, I mentioned earlier, she has one of her books is about creating a climate-friendly yard, because that's another thing. As you think about how much carbon is spewed into the atmosphere from all of the gas-powered mowers and blowers and all of the things that we use maintaining yards, these blowers and mowers a lot of times can create the same pollution that numerous cars can each time that they're operated. And so it's something that we have to think about also, is that all of the other the footprint of our actions.
Yeah, that's great. Are there any other questions? I don't have any more on Zoom. So with that, I would like to give a big warm welcome or thank you to Jimmy Orth. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you especially from my heart for filling in so quickly and having such a wonderful presentation to give on very short notice. So for all of those of you out there, this is Jimmy's contact information. Please look up the St. John's Riverkeeper. They're a great resource. They do amazing work, and they're really advocates for all of us and the work that they do for the river. So thank you. All right, I have a couple of party messages for you I wanted to tell you about. So we have a great series of programs for children called Budding Gardeners. And we have one this Saturday about what we call it hot potato. And it's because sweet potatoes grow so well in the summer heat in Jacksonville, and it's really easy to do. And so we have Elizabeth Davis of the overalls group. So if you're not familiar with the man in overalls, she's one of the overalls people. And she is going to be leading this and teaching all of the kids how to make, how to grow sweet potatoes, and they'll get to take them home and grow them in their yards. We also have one coming up on July 16th, Friendly Snakes. And we are partnering with MOSH, the Museum of Science and History. And they're going to bring some really cool snakes here and talk about friendly snakes, because most of the snakes in Florida are actually very friendly and very beneficial to your yard. When you find one in your yard, you should say thank you. Only a couple of dangerous ones, and they're really not going to kill you, but you also learn about which ones to avoid. And then we have our Fun with Flowers program coming up on July 14th. It's with Samantha Wilson of the St. John's Flower Market, and she is very well versed in French floral technique, and so you'll learn all about that at Fun with Flowers on July 14th. We would like you to give us some feedback. And so we have a survey. We have a QR code that you can scan back there, or you can scan it on the screen right now. And we'll also send it to you in an email afterward. We want your feedback. We want to know how this program was, what you thought, and what ideas you have for programs in the future. We just so happen to have Linda Irwin, who is our Vice President of Programs, here today. And we'll be doing a lot of meeting about programs in the next 2 days and coming up with lots of great ideas. So if you get this survey and take it now, your ideas can be in there for the consideration for the rest of the year and next year. All right. I also want to thank once again the Jessie Ball DuPont Fund for their generous grant to make programs like this possible. And I want to thank all of you for being here, because if you weren't here, we'd just be talking to ourselves, and that's not a lot of fun. I want to thank Jill, I want to thank Jimmy, and I want to thank Eva, and have a great evening, everyone.